Chapter 17. Which was worse, being alone in the dark house with Patch, or having nothing to eat but warm water with a few leaves floating around on top? No mussels were left, no limpets, no dulse. Strangers had come to the sea and taken everything, and now even they were gone. I sat at the hearth that night, glad that Da had left us with enough turf to burn until he came back. I closed my eyes, missing him so much I had a pain in my chest. For a moment, I saw him under the waves. I sat up straight. I couldn't think about that. And then I saw it poking out of a basket. My knitting. Better yet, Celia's. 2 shawls. Mine was foo-far, but the other was lovely. Great girl Astor, Celia, I whispered. Patch looked up from his wall of stones. Are you saying your prayers, Nory? I smiled at him. No, talking to my own self. I patted the floor next to me and he scooted over. Skinny as a strand of the wool. Do you remember potatoes? He had the sound of an old man. I gave him a hug. I'll knit these shawls as fast as I can and we'll take them to Ballally straight away and sell them. For coins? Patch asked dreamily. Yes, I said, and we will turn those coins into food. What do you think of that? I turned Celia's shawl right side out, then wrong side out. I fiddled with the needles, knit next, purl, did something about the fringe. I sat there with the knitting in my lap, staring first at the wool, the color of the oats, and then at the turf and the hearth, bits of glowing orange blocks. My legs were heavy and my arms weak. It was hard to think. Patch shook me. Don't sleep, Nory. I jumped. The fire was low now, and outside it was dark. I sat absolutely still, trying to listen to the creakings that might mean footsteps, the she, or strangers looking for food, looking for turf, ready to take them from me. On my lap was food, a shawl to be turned into coins, turned into a loaf of bread. If I could just think about how to do it. I took a breath. We will go to Anna's, I said, to show her the shawl, and she'll tell me how to finish it. And she'll give us milk? Patch said. I shook my head. No, the cow is gone. Gone with Muck and Biddy to England. They'll be English animals now, not Irish. I thought about leaving Patch there in the house alone. I wondered if he was too weak to walk across the double field to Anna's, but I could see him falling asleep, leaning forward and tumbling into the fire. Not only that, I was afraid to go alone. The wet grass squeaked under our feet. I closed the door carefully so no traveler would think it was empty, and took Patch's hand in mine. I knew the she searched for boys to drag down into their rings, but Patch's skirt was long enough to dip along the ground and his hair covered his ears. No one could guess he was a boy. I stood in front of the closed door and peered across the yard at the road, and I looked everywhere to be sure I was out there. Come on now, I said, we're safe. The Mallon's house was a black smudge in the fog, the stone walls sleeping, the worn path quiet as we tiptoed over it. We ran the last few feet, breathless. I raised my hand to knock at Anna's door, but before I touched the wood, the door opened and we rushed inside. Anna looked pale and sick, but her voice was strong. It's late for a visit, she said. I held up the knitting. I don't know how to finish this. She took the shawl from me and put it on the table. I was so glad to be there, so glad Patch and I weren't alone, that I sank down on the floor in front of the hearth. Anna swung the kettle over the fire, and when the water bubbled up, she threw in a handful of dried herbs. Patch was sleeping in an instant, fallen across the straw in the corner. Anna covered him with a rusty black coat and came back to the fire to give me a cup of water and pour one on for herself. I sipped at the bitter drink, telling myself not to think about the trip back down to my own dark house or the mist outside, or the she hiding in the hedges at the grab our feet. Instead, I watched Anna take the bundled up knitting from the table. As I took the last sip, she moved closer to the fire and began to knit. She picked at the wool, patted it, dug the needles into it, and then her fingers were flying, the yarn moving up and over one needle and across to the other. Patch's breath was soft, and even in his corner, I breathed with him, thinking of Maggie and Da, of Celia and Grand out on the road, and of Sean Red. Where was he sleeping? Was he lying on the side of the road near the bay, freezing this night? Or had he made it back to his house? I shivered. And then I thought of Anna's son, Tig. If it had been daytime with the door open and the light coming in, I would have never asked. But inside we were close together and warm, with the fire throwing great shadows on the stone walls. The only sounds were the click of the needles and Patch's breath. And I blurted out, Tell me about Tig. The needles clicked for another moment. Then she began to talk. He was always singing, never still. And after he was gone, the whole world seemed quiet. I thought there'd never be another like him. I swallowed my tea. But then, she said, years later I began to watch someone, a small child backed up against the wall, her mother dying, and there was nothing I could do. She held out her hands. Nothing I knew would save that young mother. I made a sound. Ma'am? Of course you would have tried to save me. How could I have thought otherwise? Anna nodded. This child had such love in her, a laughing child, brave like my son. She sang. She climbed over walls. She left gates open. She danced through the cemetery and over the cliffs. Anna ran her old hands over the shawl on her lap. And I loved her for that. Loved her always. Me. She was talking about me. But there was more, Anna said. I had spent a lifetime learning about plants and what they could do to heal. She bent her head. I had to teach all this to someone. I knew that the girl who sang, the little girl who could remember the words in the songs, would remember the herbs and the magic of them. She looked up and I could see the tears in those faded blue eyes. But she was afraid, Anna said. Afraid of my magic. Afraid of me. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth. Oh, Anna, I said. She reached forward, grasping my hand. My coin didn't matter. I'm an old woman and it doesn't make any difference if I die as long as I pass that healing on to you. I wiped the tears that dripped down my own cheeks. I was bursting with love for her. I reached out to pull her close to me and leaned my head against her cap.